when you're talking about an endgame with Iran, and this agreement, by the way, doesn't deal precisely with an endgame because there's a timeline on the agreement. I mean, even in this joint document that was signed in Geneva, it says that there will be an endgame for a certain period of time. So it's not a real endgame. I guess that's the long-term interim agreement, because the endgame is supposed to be sort of removing all these sanctions and not putting them under pressures, and that's a problem. And hopefully it can be corrected in a final round, because we want sort of a permanent solution to this problem. And I know it's said that, listen, they have the know-how. You know, the scientists are there. But I have news for you. If you take 1,000 nuclear scientists and you put them on a desert island, they can't spin each other into uranium. You need centrifuges. You need uranium in order to do it. You need that infrastructure. So when you're dealing with the endgame with Iran, it really boils down to sort of 4 different areas, I would say. One is the heavy water facility in Arak, which is the plutonium route to a weapon. If you have no plutonium, if you have no heavy water reactor, you can't get the plutonium production. So it's critical that they need that. And the President of the United States recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, President Obama said that they don't need a heavy water facility for a peaceful program. And so I assume that the position of the United States in the P5+1 will be that they'd have to hopefully dismantle that heavy water facility. We'll see what will actually be put on the table. The second thing is in Fordo. You have this sort of underground bunker where they're enriching uranium. You know, their peaceful program that builds a bunker into the side of a mountain that they also don't need for a peaceful program. And that's another thing that President Obama talked about just recently in Washington, and hopefully that will be taken out of commission as well. So those are 2 positions that there's a real potential of finding a common understanding between the United States and Israel. Then there's 2 other questions that are left over. What do you do with the centrifuges, and what do you do with the enriched uranium? And Israel's position is very simple. Just as you don't need a heavy water facility to have a peaceful program, and you don't need an underground bunker where you're putting your centrifuges for a peaceful program, you do not need to enrich uranium in Iran for them to have a peaceful program. A lot of people don't know that. There are 17 countries around the world that have nuclear reactors that do not domestically enrich uranium, including your northern neighbor, Canada, and your southern neighbor, Mexico. So Israel's position is very simple. Iran has to have a peaceful program. Okay, give them a peaceful program. I mean, frankly, as an aside, we don't know why they need a peaceful program, because they're awash in oil and gas, and everybody knows why they're building, ICBMs and underground facilities and heavy water reactors and all that. We know, everybody understands that they're trying to build a weapons program. But if they want to, con the world, and people want to give them a peaceful program, we say, fine, give them a peaceful program. But they do not need a domestic enrichment to have a peaceful program, and I think that's not understood. They say they have a right to enrich. No, there's no right to enrich. Why should they have a peaceful program, given that they've defied the international community for the last 10 years? They've built a secret facility at Natanz first before they were caught, and then at Fordo, this facility in the mountain, they were caught. And this is not a regime that has a track record of abiding by the Security Council resolutions about their program, so there's no reason why they should have it. And the risk that you take, it's important to understand that if you leave Iran with a domestic enrichment capability, how can you go to other countries around the world that want peaceful programs and tell them you can't have domestic enrichment capability? And then you really can blow up the whole NPT treaty. You can really blow up all these deals that you're signing with many countries around the world for civilian nuclear energy, when they come to you and they say, wait a second, Iran gets to have domestic enrichment and we can't have domestic enrichment? So we just say, look, you have the right principle. We say to the president, to the international community, you have the right principle. They shouldn't have anything that they don't need for a peaceful program. Well, they don't need a heavy water facility, they don't need this underground bunker, and they do not need domestic enrichment. Israel's position is that they should have no centrifuges, no enriched uranium, no heavy water facility, and no underground bunker there. You take that all out, then dismantle the sanctions. Before that, keep ratcheting up the pressures. The question is, how much can Israel and the United States forge a common policy? We want to forge a maximum ground on that common policy. We think on 2 of those issues we're very closely aligned. As I said, on Arak and Fordo. On the issues of uranium enrichment and centrifuges, we're discussing that with the administration. I think what some people feel, frankly, they don't feel that we're not right. They think that our position makes a lot of sense, but they say, you know what, Iran will never agree to it. You know, we'd love to have it happen, but Iran will never agree to it. And then there's two things that you have to consider. Number one is you can't run a negotiation based on what Iran will agree to or not agree to, because then you won't get anything that you want. And the second thing is don't assume that what seems like impossible today won't become possible tomorrow. Everyone says that the sanctions that you've put in place have now created a situation where Iran is prepared to do things today that they weren't prepared to do tomorrow. Who's to say in another 2 years, another 6 months, another year, that they won't be prepared to do tomorrow what they're not willing to do today? Keep ratcheting up the pressures, and you can achieve something that you might not think is achievable. Remember, you want to deal with Iran. They need to deal with you because of the pressure of these sanctions.
Well, it seems like the U.S.
Huh?
The fourth one was stockpiles.
Yeah, the enriched uranium. To get the, I'm sorry, not just when I mention enriched uranium, it's not just to stop enriching uranium in Iran, but to get the 7,000 kilos of low enriched uranium out. That's the enriched uranium, both the stockpile and the quantity. They can get fuel rods from the outside and have a civilian program. They do not need domestic enrichment in order to have nuclear power in Iran.
No, it seems like you're hearing a lot more from the administration now than before in terms of what you want to hear in terms of the positions. How about, as you put in, the chancelleries in Europe? That clearly is going to be, but the U.S. cannot unilaterally agree to, some of the positions that you were talking about. They have to get buy-in from the other partners in Europe.
Well, that's a good question, whether they have to get that buy-in, because one of the arguments that's made is, look, we have to enforce the international sanctions regime. And if we don't enforce the international sanctions regime, the whole thing will collapse. So in a sense, what people say is we have to ease the sanctions a little bit in order to sanction the sanction regime because we have all these partners. Well, look, we think that there's an alternative. Remember, the previous administration passed 2 Security Council resolutions. And they passed those resolutions because there was concern at the potential of military action. The credibility of a U.S. military threat of action actually helped build up the sanctions regime. And this administration has, I think, very effectively used also the credibility of military action, sometimes the credibility of Israeli military action, to convince a lot of partners around the world to also back very, very strong sanctions. So we believe that if you have 2 things that you're bringing to the table, one, the credibility of military action, and the president has made it clear time after time, he's committed to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It's not containment. His policy, he said, is prevention. Now, the credibility of an American military threat coupled with the strength and power of the U.S. economy. Don't forget, if people are forced to choose between doing business with Iran and doing business with the United States, doing business with a country that's a $450 billion economy versus doing business with a $16 trillion economy, believe me, they'll do business with the United States. There are alternatives. And I don't think you want to be in a position where you are staking this whole issue and resolving this issue to what this or that country, maybe in Europe or outside in the P5+1, wants to do. I don't think you have to have a very clear policy of what your position is, what your goal is that you can achieve. And I have no doubt that with the strength of the U.S. economy and the credibility of a military threat, you can achieve that objective.
But as you know, we couldn't get the deal without the French. The French at one point, which was probably fine with you because you didn't want the deal anyway.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what deal you're trying to get. And remember, the deal is not the goal. The goal is to dismantle the program. If the P5+1 succeeds in dismantling Iran's nuclear weapons program, and no country would be happier than Israel. No people would be happier than Israel. Our concern, as I said, is that this deal will not dismantle the program, and that unwittingly and unintentionally, it may make a diplomatic solution, a peaceful resolution of this problem, that much harder. As I said, Israel wants a peaceful resolution of this problem. We see the sanctions as a boiling pot that's getting hotter and hotter. It took years to raise the temperature in that pot, and in 2012 they really started to bite. It's cost Iran about $100 billion that they've absorbed in sanctions, and as I said, they're a $450 billion economy. That's a lot of money. They've invested also, you should know, about $40 billion in their program. in their nuclear weapons program. We do not feel that Iran is going to willingly give this up. We think that in order to convince Iran to give up its nuclear weapons program, you're going to have to put them before a very, very stark choice of it's either the regime and a potential collapse of their economy or the program. And our concern is that we want that pot to be boiling and boiling and boiling until basically they're presented with that dilemma. And we think prematurely reducing the temperature in that pot can be a mistake. We appreciate very much that the administration and people in the international community feel that the deal that they did in Geneva opens the pathway towards a diplomatic resolution. We believe that by reducing the temperature in that pot, which is the one tool you have to sort of force them to accept a diplomatic resolution, that actually can be undermining the prospects for diplomacy. We hope we're wrong because the deal was signed. I hope the assessments that we're given are wrong, but we don't believe they are. And we'll continue to work with the administration as closely as possible to forge common ground, but we were deeply concerned with the interim agreement that was made in Geneva, and we hope that to the extent possible, things can be rectified in a final agreement.
You know, I want to ask you, though, you mentioned the UN meeting in September, and you look at the reaction to Rouhani and the reaction to Netanyahu is like completely different. You went in and you sort of took the place by storm, and everyone was waiting first for the handshake and then the phone call. I mean, what happened there? I mean, clearly it seems you lost the PR battle there.
Well, look, here's the thing is, my prime minister is not conducting a game. He's responsible for the security and survival of 8 million people. And we have a regime that's committed to our destruction. And it's very nice that Rouhani comes in with his song and dance show. And I appreciate very much that people are weary of war after Iraq and Afghanistan and the high cost and toll of those conflicts. You know, no one wants to see war. And believe me, as I said, Israel will pay the highest price for a potential confrontation. So we understand that. And there's always this attempt to look at a new person that's coming on the scene and hope that this time is different. And if the people of Iran were really represented by the president, I suppose it would be different. But remember, there were 700 candidates who wanted to run for the president. And the Iranian regime, the Ayatollahs and the Revolutionary Guard who control that country, they allowed 6 or 7 candidates to run. And Rouhani was the person whom people in Iran thought maybe was least associated with the regime, when all of them ultimately were vetted by the regime. So Rouhani, he's not even the leader of Iran. The leader is the quote-unquote supreme leader. You know, you don't get called a supreme leader for nothing. Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard, that's Iran, the real people of Iran. They don't have a voice in their government, not through Rouhani or not through Khamenei. So when he comes there to New York, I know it's very tempting for everyone to swoon. But as I said, it's not the cheers from the gallery that's going to be important. At the end of the day, the question will be the policy. And will the international community take a stand that will prevent this regime that threatens not only Israel with annihilation, that not only threatens every single Arab state in the region. And by the way, one thing that's interesting, the Israelis and the Arabs are speaking from the same page. You know, that happens once in a century. That's like the ultimate no-spin zone. So people should pay attention when that happens. And the reason why we're speaking is because we're closer and more vulnerable. The U.S. and the Europeans and others, they're further away from this threat. So we see it for what it is. And the question that we ask ourselves is not whether the president will have a phone call and whether Rouhani has wowed people, the European diplomats who are at the United Nations. The question is, will the world prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapons capability that's a threat to us, a threat to the region, and a threat to the world? As I said before, Iran is building ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, not for Israel. They're building it for the United States. They can already reach half of Europe, and in a couple of years, they'll reach the United States. You do not put TNT on ICBMs. Maybe in cartoons you do. But in the real world, ICBMs carry nuclear warheads. Now, it's easy to dismiss that. It's easy to try to sweep it under the rug. But this is the reality they're facing. It's not a PR war. even if you win the public diplomacy war, the question will be, will they have a military nuclear capability or will they not? The responsibility of my prime minister, as the leader not just of Israel, but as leader of the one and only Jewish state that has this weight of responsibility on his shoulders, is to ensure that a country that is openly calling for the destruction of Israel will not get the weapons that would enable them to achieve their objective. And as the prime minister said at the UN, very speech that you're referring to, he said, if Israel is forced to stand alone, Israel will stand alone. But in defending ourselves, we will be defending many, many others. That's how we see this issue. It's the most serious issue facing Israel. It's the highest priority of the Prime Minister of Israel. And we will work, and I will work every day to make people aware of these dangers and to do everything that we can to ensure that the international community is adopting policies that can meet this challenge because, as the Prime Minister says, history will judge us from our actions today.
Let me sort of switch the topic really quickly to ask you about some breaking news that's happening today. The Prime Minister, as I'm sure you know, spoke this morning about the whole spying allegations of U.S. spying on the previous Prime Minister's Holmes's conversations. You'll be the one more than likely to express some of Israel's concerns to the administration on this. What right now is the thinking? Were there? I know Olmert has said there weren't any secrets revealed in these, and particularly on the email address because it was a public email address. So, sort of almost calm down a little bit. Let's not get too far. But what's your thinking?
Yeah, well, I think everyone should calm down about it. We deeply value the relationship that we have with the United States. You share very sensitive information with us. We share very sensitive information with you. This is an alliance that maybe you have one or two other countries in the world, maybe Great Britain, maybe Canada, where you have this type of alliance with those countries. So we're very appreciative of that, and I'm sure that this latest episode is not going to affect the intelligence cooperation and the intelligence sharing because both countries have so much to gain from it. It saves American lives. It saves Israeli lives. And we're your partners in a region. You look around the region, and from the Straits of Gibraltar to the Khyber Pass, you don't have a stable, reliable, democratic ally there where you can have this type of relationship. Now, we in Israel, working in the Prime Minister's office, we always take precautions with our communications for many years. Nothing to do with the United States, but we know there's probably many people listening in from around the world. So we're very careful, and I doubt very much there'll be great revelations from whatever emails or whatever information they have. What's really sensitive are things that actually we discuss together at a very high level. So I think this is going to be a blip in the relationship between the United States and Israel. We've weathered a lot worse, and we'll continue to weather all of these sort of hiccups. And I think you'll see the security and intelligence cooperation get stronger and stronger as time goes by, particularly if you want to pivot to Asia, if you want to reduce your presence in the Middle East. Who are you going to rely on in the Middle East who shares your values and it can protect your interests? Who besides the State of Israel? So I'm not sure that it's going to have a long-lasting impact. I'm sure it's never comfortable, but we'll overcome.
Prime Minister has called for an investigation, but did these allegations, these Snowden-related allegations, did it surprise or disappoint folks in the Prime Minister?
I don't think we were surprised. No, we know that you have immense capabilities. There are other countries who have similar capabilities, and as I said, having been in the Prime Minister's office for 4 or 5 years, we're very cautious with our communications.
There's a sense of optimism that I was just in the region. In fact, I met with Bill, and we talked about it a little bit. This cautious optimism that it hadn't seen there in a long time. And in fact, Abbas was saying in South Africa last week that he thinks that there'll be a deal next year. What's your opinion?
Well, that would be wonderful if there is. I think that the Secretary has managed the situation quite well. He's decided that he should be the only one to comment on what's actually happening in the talks, because what's happened in the past is you've had all sorts of leaks, in past peace processes going back a long time, all sorts of leaks which sort of undermine the efforts of the parties to engage in in-depth good faith negotiations and to try to reach an understanding, and then that creates enormous political instability on both sides. Whereas the best way is to try to quietly sit down, to negotiate all the final status issues, and the Secretary, I think, has wisely chosen that he should be the only one to comment, and I'm not going to break it, even for the Miami Herald, my favorite paper. But I will tell you this, all Israelis deeply appreciate the efforts that he's made to try to advance peace. I say all Israelis except for my wife, because every time your Secretary of State goes, I have to go to Israel. So I've been back and forth also like a yo-yo a bunch of times, but we understand that he's committed to our security. He wants to see a lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And I can assure you that if President Abbas of the Palestinians is prepared to finally recognize Israel as a Jewish state, the nation state of the Jewish people, to cross the psychological Rubicon that none of his predecessors have been willing to cross, and if they're serious about addressing Israel's legitimate security needs, which are enormous, they were enormous before the so-called Arab Spring, before all the changes that we've had. Now with those changes, we don't know what's going to happen in 6 months, or 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years. We don't know what's going to happen on the other side of the borders. And Israel has to have security arrangements on the ground that are rock solid. We had the experience of Lebanon, where we left every square inch of Lebanon. And we didn't actually advance peace. What we advanced is an Iranian forward terror base on our northern border, from which thousands of rockets were fired on Israel's northern cities. And now there's tens of thousands of rockets from Iran's proxy Hezbollah pointed at the state of Israel. We left every square inch of Gaza. We went back to the international border. And instead of advancing peace, we advanced another Iranian proxy, Hamas. And thousands of rockets were fired at Israel's southern cities from there. And they have thousands more that are pointed at us. Now, Israelis don't know that much about baseball. But somehow the concept of 3 strikes and you're out made it in translation. We cannot just simply walk out of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. We can't simply just walk out of there and hope for the best. We have to have security arrangements on the ground that will ensure that we do not have a repeat of what happened in Lebanon or what happened in Gaza, because we're a very, very small country. 95%, maybe even 99% of Israel's security problems are the physical size of the country. Now, I know most people in the world think the greatest problem in the Middle East is that Israel's too big. But the truth of the matter is we're a very small country, and a small country that faces security threats not faced by any country on earth. We're the size of New Jersey. Egypt is 50 times the size of Israel. America's 500 times the size of Israel, and has, as I said, an Atlantic and a Pacific that are very welcoming neighbors that control your borders. So when you're a country that small and you have thousands and tens of thousands of rockets, even short-range rockets that wouldn't seem like they'd be a serious threat, they can become a threat because they can target your airfields, they can target your strategic installations, and they can bring maybe 80% of your population within the range of short-range rockets. Now, Israel can't live under those situations. So when we're negotiating a peace agreement, my Prime Minister wants to know that he has a partner who's willing to end the conflict once and for all, who's willing to recognize the nation-state of the Jewish people. Just as you asked me to recognize the state for Palestinians, I want you to recognize self-determination for the Jewish people. Okay? It's never been a border dispute. That's always been what the dispute has been. Will you recognize the permanence of a Jewish state in any border? But after the leaders recognize it, it may take time for those ideas to percolate down. We're not saying until every last person, every Palestinian accept this, we're not willing to do anything. And we have major issues with what's happening today in Palestinian society. Major issues with what they read in their textbooks and what they see on television and what they hear. Tremendous incitement that poisons a new generation against the state of Israel. So we say, yes, the leaders will cross the Rubicon. And we hope they will. We hope President Abbas will. It'll take time for that to percolate down. While that's percolating down, Israel needs to have security arrangements on the ground that can protect the peace and can also protect Israel if the peace unravels. That's what we're trying to negotiate today. And as I said, we appreciate what the Secretary is trying to do. We know that American Secretary of State has a lot on his plate. There are a lot of problems going on in the world, and we appreciate that he has devoted a lot of time. And I think it's because of his devotion that we've gotten peace talks underway up until this point. It's not only because of his devotion, it's also because my prime minister was willing to release 104 killers, terrorists. A lot of leaders in the world, a lot of governors wouldn't release a single killer. He's released 104 terrorists. It shows his commitment to try to advance peace, to try to get into a negotiation with President Abbas, where maybe we can end this conflict once and for all. So he wants to do it. I think the secretary wants to do it. The question will be, do we have someone on the Palestinian side? Do we have President Abbas, a leader who's really prepared to make a historic compromise that will require concessions from him and concessions from Israel? If we have that leader in President Abbas, we will have peace in the year.
If not Abbas, who?
Well, you know, that's what they said about Arafat. They said, you got to make peace with Arafat, because if you don't make peace with Arafat, you're never going to have. Now they say it's President Abbas. Peace, if you're going to have peace between Israelis and Palestinians, can't hinge on one person. The idea that peace hinges on one person is wrong. It's true. You need a leader to take that first step. But peace has to be much broader. And Israelis and Palestinians live cheek by jowl. We are so close. We don't have a Sinai desert in between us and most of the population as we had with Egypt. We are living in communities that are interwoven in such in such proximity to one another, and we know that there's a long history here, a long history of conflict. This conflict, I know most of the world thinks the conflict started in 1967 when Israel entered the territory, and the conflict is about the settlements. You know, people used to say that the major problem in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, even 3 years ago, people were actually writing this. Serious people were writing that if only we resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the problems in the Middle East will be resolved. Now, think about how ridiculous that looks now. After Tunisia, after Egypt, after Syria, after everything that's happening in the Middle East. It's absurd. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be solved on its own terms and for its own sake, because we want peace with the Palestinians, because they're our neighbors and they're going to be long. It's not the elixir for the Middle East. It never has been. It never will be. But there's another idea that sort of dies hard, and that's the whole problem is the settlements. If we would just resolve this settlement problem, we'd resolve everything. Well, I know people's sense of history, and my prime minister says sometimes, goes all the way back to breakfast. But for the people who have a long sense of history, they might think that the world started in 1967. On June 4th, 1967, the world began, and all the problems began from there. No. Israelis and Palestinians had a conflict that went back 50 years, nearly 50 years, since 1921, when there was an attack on the Jewish immigration office in Jaffa. And in 1929, there was an attack against the Jewish community in Hebron. In 1936, 1939, there were riots. In 1948, when Israel was established, 5 Arab armies tried to choke it out. And in June 4th, 1967, those were not lines of peace. Those were the armistice lines from where a war began. So this conflict went on for a half a century before that. People want to reject that. People don't want to accept it because it's easier for them to think that if we could only stop the construction of apartments somewhere in the suburbs of Jerusalem or the suburbs of Tel Aviv, that we're going to bring peace in it. That's not the problem. Is refusal to recognize a Jewish state. I'm telling you that once that happens, you can get peace, if not in weeks, in months. You will be able to resolve all this. There's a lot of issues. We have to deal with settlements. We have to deal with territory. We'll have to deal with the refugees. We have to deal with Jerusalem. We have to deal with all the final status issues. But the core of the conflict has always been that. And we hope that we will have in President Abbas a partner who's willing to take the first step and to lead his people to accept a historic resolution of the conflict.
And these discussions that are taking place, is it about a comprehensive or just in terms of about specific?
Well, I'll just say that your president mentioned, President Obama mentioned the idea of creating a sort of a framework for dealing with all these issues. So since he said that already, and since that was reported, I'll leave it at that. But other than that, I will allow you to bring the Secretary of State into the Miami Herald to give you the full description, because he's the one empowered to do so.
We'll do that after the next one. But I wonder.
Well, before you go, I wonder if you could give us sort of an outline of your travels here in the U.S. and where else you're going to be, how long you're going to be here.
Well, I haven't gotten a chance to travel that much in the U.S. because your Secretary of State has made his many trips to Israel, and
He's drawing you back.
Yeah, and he offered me a ride once when they met in Rome. He actually offered me a ride back, and I appreciate that. But then I had to go. My prime minister said, "You're coming back to Jerusalem," so I went with him. And one of these days, I'll be able to take the trip back with him. Maybe the trip there, it would be good. But I haven't had a chance to travel that widely. I began as Israel's ambassador officially only on December 3rd when I presented credentials to your president. It was a very moving ceremony to me, somebody who was born and raised in the United States, and you certainly roll out the red carpet in a way that is befitting of a superpower. I took my family to see the president. I walked into the Oval Office and I introduced the president to I had met the president. I've met him a number of times. In fact, my claim to fame, and I always needle your ambassador, Dan Shapiro, who was an excellent ambassador in Israel, that I've been in all the meetings between the president and the prime minister. I was even in the meeting in the superintendent's room in Reagan National Airport, their first ever meeting that they had, when it was then Senator Barack Obama and then head of the opposition, Netanyahus. So I've been to all their meetings, so it wasn't the first time I had an opportunity to meet with the president, but it was the first time I got to introduce him to my family. And my wife came with our baby girl. We have five children. I have a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, 7-year-old, 2-year-old, and a 6-month-old. China is in a different place than it was a few short years ago. Israel is very sympathetic to the family in hopes that they will also get the resolution that they want to achieve. We are very sympathetic. The Prime Minister of Israel comes, as I said, from a family who suffered, whose brother was struck down trying to free hostages from terrorists at Entebbe. He understands this very well. And throughout this entire process, I can assure you, throughout this entire process, the Prime Minister was focused on that family all the time. There wasn't a day that went by where he wasn't focused on that family. It doesn't mean that they have the resolution that they want, but he was always focused on that family. And this suggestion that the Prime Minister turned his back on that family is false. It's false. And as I said at the beginning, all I can tell you is the strategic relationship between Israel and China is in a different place today. Testifying in a court of law would undermine the security relationships and intelligence relationships we have with countries around the world, and it will undermine your relationships that you have if that's a precedent. If your courts decide that an intelligence official can be subpoenaed to speak in open testimony about information that he received in bilateral contacts with other states, how are you going to be able to conduct any of those intelligence relationships with countries around the world? So for sure, Israel cannot allow someone to testify of information he got in an official capacity. There's no question about it.
Mr. Invest, I know you've been very generous with the time. Can
I ask, this is a totally provincial question, but I think of interest to anybody who lives here. You mentioned being a son of both nations is important and influences you in your position now, but I wonder if your upbringing here in particular gives you any sort of unique perspective in your position now?
Well, it affects my taste in music, for sure, and, good coffee. Took my friends here to get some Cuban coffee this morning. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I have to tell you one thing. My predecessor, Michael Oren, was also born and raised in the United States, so he was the first American-born ambassador. But he's 16 years older than I am. He's a different generation. I grew up I went to a Jewish day school. I did not grow up experiencing anti-Semitism, which is a unique phenomenon of Jews of my generation, because older Jews did experience that. And I think if you had my predecessor, Michael, he would speak to you about being the only Jew at his high school in New Jersey that he went to, and he was exposed to anti-Semitism.
You also grew up in Miami Beach.
I grew up in
a
Miami.
certain era.
Yeah, no, for sure. But I also think it's a different place that the American Jewish community has. The greatness about America is it's allowed Jews, Jewish Americans, to have a hyphen. There's Irish Americans, Italian Americans, African Americans, Jewish Americans, and to be full partners in American life. I felt that growing up completely. Never had any qualms about my identity here as an American and the acceptance. I moved to Israel because I wanted to help another nation that I was emotionally connected to fight what I thought were very difficult battles that they were going to face ahead. I graduated in 1993 from college, and that was the end of history in the United States. There were no great issues of the day. And in Israel, I saw that all of its great questions were in front of it. All the great decisions were in front of it. And I wanted to be part of that process, and also to help defend Israel against what I thought were a great libel against a democratic state that actively seeks peace with all its neighbors. I mean, you see what is written about Israel and what is said about Israel, and it's mind-boggling. You just saw last week that this ASA, this organization, this academic organization that calls for a boycott of Israel. I mean, it's outrageous. There are dozens of countries in the world where academics are in prison. There are dozens more where an academic is not free to say what he wants or research what he wants or write what he wants. And here you take Israel, the one democracy in this whole region. Look, you have to understand, Israel says, well, we're the one democracy in the Middle East. And people say, wow, well, that's a big deal with the Middle East. No, it is a big deal. Imagine what America, you remember what America was like on September 12th, the day after 9/11? And then the battles that ensued afterwards about civil liberties and security, and how do you find this balance? Well, Israel's been on September 12th for 65 years. And we've always had a democracy in Israel. And we always seek to try to find that balance. Doesn't mean we're a perfect country. It doesn't mean that you don't make mistakes. But if you look at what Israel has achieved, given the security threats that Israel faces, it is remarkable. No country can compare to it. Faced with these types of existential threats that we keep civil liberties in the way we do for our population, it's hard. It's hard to work through these issues here when you've got separated between the Atlantic and the Pacific. But believe me, when you have a direct threat on your own homeland, when missiles are falling on your cities in real time, when suicide bombers climb on your buses, dealing with maintaining a strong and vibrant democracy is not an easy thing. And I think Israel has passed that test very well with flying colors and is an example that other democracies can look at. What does a democracy under threat, how does it behave? I think we're a model for other democracies around the world. And so when I saw Israel being maligned and being libeled, I wanted to do everything I could to help this country fend off that challenge. And that's what I hope to do as Israel's ambassador to the United States. You do a lot of things. You work with the administration and you work with Congress, and you get to meet and go around the country and speak to editorial boards. But the one thing you have to do as Israel's ambassador is you're asked to defend the Jewish people and to defend the Jewish state. That's what you do. That's what my predecessors did, from Abba Eban to Yitzhak Rabin to my immediate predecessor, Michael Oren. That's the challenge that we have. And Israel is a country that has to defend itself. It has to defend all its actions, but it has to do something more, which no country is asked to do. It has to defend its right to exist. See, the difference is when Israel is seen as doing something wrong, suddenly our whole existence is supposedly hanging in the balance. We have to justify our existence to others. We shouldn't have to justify. The Jewish people have a right of self-determination in the land of Israel. That's what it means to be a Zionist. The Jewish people have a right to self-determination in this land. Just like other peoples have a right to self-determination, the Jews have a right to self-determination. We'll try to be the greatest nation that we can be. We'll try to perfect, as they say in America, to perfect the union, to always improve. And America's a nation that over the course of time has had to perfect itself. People forget, for nearly a century in this country, African Americans were slaves. Nearly a century more it took to get civil rights. For over 100 years, women did not have the right to vote in this country. This democratic process is constantly trying to perfect itself, more and more and more. And Israel must always try to perfect itself, must always try to improve. But the place where we have to defend that should be in the Israeli Knesset, in our parliament. We should not have to suffer the slings and arrows of the rest of the world condemning Israel, castigating Israel, excoriating it, and being challenged day after day to defend its right to exist. That's something we shouldn't do. Israel should not be judged by a different standard than the rest of the world. You should never judge Israel based on its ideal. That's for the people of Israel to do. Israel should be judged at how other countries have operated, faced in similar circumstances, faced with similar challenges. How would other countries behave? And here, the fact that I was born and raised in the United States helps me a lot. Because the first question I ask myself in Israel is the WWAD question. What would America do? Because I think this is a very moral nation. A very moral nation. And in the history of the world has been as moral, certainly the most moral superpower in the history of the world, for sure. And I think Israel can put a record up against anybody. And when my sort of moral compass, having been born and raised in this country, I look at what Israel has done and how decently it's treated those who were actually bent on its annihilation, how it always extended its hand for peace, time after time. And when its home front was under attack, as I said, that it protected civil liberties. I think that we are a stellar example of democracy, and I have no doubt that centuries from now people will study this democracy in Israel, and be amazed when they get some perspective of history, be amazed at just what this country has been able to accomplish, never knowing a full day of peace in its entire existence, always having to fight for its existence and still maintaining, being this, as they say, the shining star in the east.